The direct benefits to Maryland are small, if not infinitesimal. We do know that if we don't have these extra lines, then we may have problems with the grid. We may have brownouts, but only because we have to get that energy through somewhere. And if it doesn't come through that line, it will come from somewhere else and maybe from parts of Maryland.
That was Baltimore County Delegate Michelle Guyton talking about the Maryland Piedmont Reliability Project during another one of our town halls earlier this year on the same issue. She's just one of the state lawmakers on both sides of the aisle voicing their concerns about the project. Joining me now is one of those lawmakers, State Senator Justin Reedy. We also have Joanne Frederick, president of the Stop MPRP group. Thank you both for joining us again. Now, Joanne, I want to start with that meeting that you recently had with Governor Westmore's team. This was a meeting that we have talked about several times. You've been trying to get something on the books with Governor Westmore himself. Who did you meet with?
I met with Connor Shin, who's Governor Moore's energy policy advisor, and Deputy Chief of Staff Hernandez.
And how did that go?
Yeah, I appreciate their time, and it had been scheduled and had gotten rescheduled multiple times over the last 5 to 6 weeks. So we finally made it happen yesterday afternoon at 4 o'clock, and I appreciate their time. I think that was thoughtful. I think there were two positives. One is they reiterated that they would ensure that the process in Maryland is followed. And we heard Chair Hoover speak a little earlier about this process and the length and scrutiny that the project will undergo. So the governor's office is certainly supporting the process that the state will conduct. And the governor, through his team, said that he is open to any and all of the above solutions to solve Maryland's energy challenges.
What does that mean?
Well, optimistically, it means that we can increase generation as needs to be done in the state of Maryland to avoid the need for transmission. Pessimistically, it could mean additional interregional transmission solutions and more lines running across Maryland. But I will give them the benefit of the doubt from an optimistic perspective and hope that we'll really lean forward into those solutions that are not transmission-based.
I know the governor has said that he, has real concerns about the use of eminent domain, especially when it comes to this specific project, and he said that he would stand with the people of Maryland on this project. Senator Reedy, what do you take that to mean when he says that he's going to stand with the people of Maryland?
Well, I think we've seen, and I'm glad Joanne was able to have this meeting on behalf of the community, but I think I'm glad to hear those positive tones, but it's very broad. And standing with the people of Maryland could very easily be shifted to, well, we can't have brownouts for the people of Maryland, so we have to do this. I'm glad to hear that the governor and his staff are open to alternatives. They have expressed concern about following the process, which is great. We really need to take, I've talked about this a lot, we talked about in the legislative session, greater action to increase our energy production in the state. A lot of that's more long range, long term, but we need to do more than we did in the last legislative session. I think we have to decide, are we going to be an energy production state or are we going to be a transmission state? Because I'm firmly opposed to this line, I don't believe it makes sense for a lot of the reasons that your guests have already talked about, but there will be more transmission lines coming into the state one way or the other if we don't get more energy production online. And it can't just be the wind and the sun. It's got to be more immediate, things like natural gas being reinvigorated, particularly very important.
Have you had any conversations with the governor personally about this project, MPRP, about some of the concerns that your constituents have about it?
Very briefly when I had an opportunity to be with him early in session, but very surfacey. And I say that just it was a quick conversation about the concerns. His staff I have talked with off and on throughout the process, trying to get a sense of where they're going to be. Up until, in this recent meeting is good, but have been concerned that it's been a lot of, well, we just have to see what happens with the process, have to see what happens with the process. And I understand that it is a quasi-judicial process at the PSC, and you can hear from Mr. Hoover how he has to be careful what he says, which is true, of course. But the governor appoints every member of the PSC. The governor appoints all of his state agencies. I'm glad the state agencies have been holding PSEG's feet to the fire to get some of these things done. But yeah, when it comes down to it, or I'm hoping there will be more control exerted internally even to try to keep this from being this catastrophic 70-mile extension cord. You asked the question earlier about people accepting it or not. This would be one thing, and I've said this to any group whether they're 100% against it or not. It'd be one thing if this was a 7 or 8 mile line. It would just be different. We wouldn't be happy, but it would be a lot different. We're talking about 70 miles, and this is just a totally invasive in our communities.
And we've heard, the extension cord line from Pennsylvania down to data centers in Virginia. And data centers, that is part of the conversation that we're hearing at the national level, even with President Donald Trump, even just today talking about the importance of, investing in AI and data centers and the future for the country. How do you feel about that as a Republican, hearing the president talking about that as the future for the country? Do you think that that is necessary, knowing what the amount of power that something like that will take?
I think as the president talks about AI, he's looking at it from a national security and technological investment point of view, and I don't think he's wrong. There is clearly an issue. We have to figure out how we're going to power these data centers in different communities, and we don't want, I believe, internationally subsidized, internationally invested tech companies, that have Middle Eastern investment coming into a community and basically putting a data center without the right kind of power infrastructure. Now, I'm not anti-data center necessarily. It's obviously something that's necessary to power our economy. But what we've seen with Virginia is it doesn't just impact Northern Virginia, it impacts the whole grid, 13-state grid that we're a part of. And I've even been supportive in the past, before this power line was announced, of saying, hey, we could get one in Maryland. We could get one in Maryland. It's good property tax revenue. It creates some jobs. But I'll be the first to admit, I didn't know as much of the impact it would have on the grid until this whole thing has happened. And so, it's a challenging environment. We can't be afraid of technological advancement in the future. But we also, I think, have to look at all the options. And so I can appreciate what the president had to say about it, but I also think he also wants our country to get back into producing more energy. Sure. So it's got to go hand in hand.
And I know, the conversation surrounding nuclear was really central in Annapolis this year, and that's a long-term conversation. That isn't something that the state of Maryland is going to be able to, flip a switch and have a new nuclear plant up and running next year. Looking at next year's legislative session, what do you think lawmakers need to do to target energy generation in the state if you don't want Maryland to be a transmission state, if you want it to be more of a generation state, to ensure that, another MPRP doesn't come up?
Yeah. Well, look, I think we need to accelerate and continue to accelerate the growth of nuclear, because that is really important for the long-term future. And there's some technologies coming online hopefully soon that will make it easier to have smaller sites. Yeah. But you're right, that's not a next year solution. That's a 3 or 4 years down the road solution. Had we focused on that instead of offshore wind for a decade, we would be in a better spot. But we are where we are. We need to keep/reopen almost closed power plants like Brandon Shores. And part of the reason some of these plants closed is that you'll hear it was expensive to operate these coal-fired and natural gas-fired plants. Well, the fact is a lot of that was external pressure from interest groups that caused shareholders to get wobbly on it. So there's a lot of factors, and we need to keep some of the plants open that are supposed to be about to close. And we need to do more to invest in making the state more friendly for natural. We need to invite natural gas energy production in without the caveats of it's got to later be turned into to nitrogen, and some of the things we did this session that were sort of good, but we put all these riders on them this last legislative session, passing bills that were a little bit of progress, but could have been so much more progress. And we need to, I think, take some of those shackles off in the next legislative session.
But do you think the Democrats will be willing to do that, given the fact that they pushed for, like you mentioned, offshore wind? I mean, we're seeing what's happening in Ocean City, and that's being relitigated again, and we're nowhere near that being built at this point. How many years later we're still having that conversation? Are lawmakers really out of touch about what's really going on and the energy needs of the state?
I think a lot of them are, and I think as these energy prices rise, there's been a little bit of gamesmanship, or a little bit of cheap populism on tell the energy companies, tell BGE their rates are outrageous. Well, I'm definitely not here carrying a brief for the utility companies by any means, but there's also the factor of there's policies that the Democratic majority in Annapolis has been behind that make it very hard to produce reliable, affordable energy in the state. And so if you have to get energy from outside the state, it's more expensive. Now, I do want to say we're here talking about MPRP, and there's been very bipartisan cooperation and support to try to slow this down.
Yes.
And I definitely want to keep the focus on it. And I appreciate that from my Democratic colleagues. So I'm not trying to be too partisan here, but we definitely have got to get people to understand there's a real reason your electricity prices go up. There's a reason that they're looking at more out-of-state transmission, and it's a direct result of the policies we've had here.
Joanne, looking at the conversation that you had with the governor's staff, moving forward and hearing what we heard from the PSC chair, how are you feeling? How optimistic or maybe not so optimistic are you feeling about, the next 6 months, the next year ahead for this project?
Other than, wanting this all to go away and not thinking about a year ahead of this. I think, the other thing that the governor's team said is really focus on the process at the PSC and the CPCN process and bring forward all potential alternatives and solutions. And we are absolutely happy to do that. And it's a burden on the people. The people that are fighting this project have to pay for the experts and the testimony and the attorneys to go through that entire process, while at the same time, all ratepayers also reimburse PSEG for all of their expenses. So we're paying twice to defend our land, and that is seems a bit unfair, but that won't stop us from doing it, because that's what we need to do. And I think that's the point. Do we need data centers? Absolutely. We certainly, I don't want to be traveling, 4 days, 5 days a week for the rest of my life like I used to do before there were data centers. So I think that's an important part of our modern future. But bring the power to them and put them in the places that make sense and they don't infringe on local communities, and make sure they bring their own power. And I actually think data centers could be a part of the new future of energy and how it gets created and delivered across the nation. But again, I need a leader that's got the courage to step up and say, hey, we're going to do this different, and here's how it's going to happen, and we're going to carve a better way into the future for the nation. And I am ready to have that conversation at any moment in time.
All right. Well, we should point out that we did invite Delegate Michelle Guyton as well as Governor Wes Moore to take part in tonight's town hall. They declined our invitation. Stay with us. Our conversation will continue right after this.